The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sarah, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have entered this webinar listening in your computer speaker system by default. If you would like to switch to the phone for any reason, you can do so in the audio pane by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed there for you. You are in listen-only mode. This simply means that you are muted so we don't pick up any noise from your end. We do welcome and encourage you to submit your text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and we will save them for the Q&A at the end of today's presentation. If you have any technical difficulties or questions, please type them into that same questions pane, and I will respond to you directly to resolve those as soon as possible. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive a follow-up email that will include the recording. By submitting your questions today, you agree to have them read aloud and recorded. All right, without any further ado, I would like to turn things over to your presenter today, Jim Safransky. Welcome, Jim. You now have the floor.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar intended to help customers maximize Salesforce functionality, increase user adoption, and thereby increase that infamous ROI, or return on investment. Looks like we've got a nice diverse audience, so thank you for joining us. Hope you get something out of this. I'm sure you will. Now, by way of introduction, my name is Jim Safransky. I'm the Director of Sales for one of our practices at Vertex, specifically the Salesforce practice. You can probably tell by my age that I've got a few years behind me, 10 plus years of Salesforce application deployment training experience. I actually spent almost 3 years with Salesforce as a services accounts director. I do have 3 Salesforce certifications, and my background is engineering, marketing, and finance. So I've tried to leverage all of those credentials as I work with customers or prospective customers across multiple industries, across multiple applications, and I've been doing so for quite a number of years. So today's webinar is intended to be educational in nature. So at the tail end, per Sarah, the more questions, the better. We'd like you to get as much out of this as is possible. While we are both a certified Salesforce implementation partner and certified ISV, or independent software vendor partner, we're keenly aware of Salesforce best practices, how best to plan for, design, and implement Salesforce to deliver maximum functionality. And that's the sort of thing we want to share with you this afternoon. So we'll start by reinforcing the decision your companies have made by selecting one or more of Salesforce's cloud solutions. But we'll also highlight some of the common challenges that people are seeing, that's being recognized and actually discussed throughout the industry. And we'll provide some value realization examples, some scenario examples intended to help you avoid those pitfalls, those challenges, and again, maximize value and ROI. So let's kind of first set the stage and talk about the Salesforce application, which was first released in 1999 as a cloud-based CRM, customer relationship management application, which was really a Salesforce automation tool. But based on Salesforce's 3 releases a year since 1999, the functionality that was offered back then was a bit more limited to what is available now. Over the years, Salesforce has become an enterprise platform capable of delivering not only Salesforce automation, but much, much more. They've achieved this both through organic growth and, as you probably well know, by acquisition as well. So why is this important? Well, it's to highlight the fact that Salesforce isn't the simple CRM solution of 1999. It has become a comprehensive and incredibly capable enterprise solution, and we've got to treat it as such. We've got to respect its capabilities and its complexity, but once you do, you'll be able to achieve that ROI and even competitive differentiation that we're all looking for. So for those of you who are familiar with the Gartner Magic Quadrant, this slide will probably come as no surprise to you. This is the 2018 release as of June of this year by Gartner for Salesforce automation, aka CRM. Now, Salesforce has led in this space for the last 10 consecutive years, so I think it's safe to say it's an incredibly capable platform. It can do a lot. If it couldn't, or if it wasn't living up to its expectations, it wouldn't have owned this space for the last 10 years. Now, what we're looking at is a two-dimensional component of this Magic Quadrant. One is the completeness of vision. The other is the ability to execute. Well, that's great for a little two-dimensional matrix, but it's missing two others that I think are probably more near and dear to your heart, and that is time to implement and cost to implement. So while Gartner has again put Salesforce at the top right-hand corner of that Magic Quadrant, if you read the report, they do identify a number of cautions. I'll call them challenges, because caution is something that you typically cannot necessarily avoid, but a challenge is one that you can address head on, as I'm sure you'll agree with by the end of today's session. So Gartner broke it up into two different categories as based on responses from, again, actual Salesforce customers. They were hearing that people said they're not getting enough value. They're having difficulty attaining value and ROI, low user adoption, obviously those are correlated, and they're just not realizing the business results that they were expecting. The second category was functional satisfaction, or maybe dissatisfaction. People have been complaining that it's difficult to use, lacks some key functionality like activity management, sales content management, and amazingly, poor pipeline management. So with these challenges and with literally the hundreds of thousands of customers that Salesforce has, why is it that many of those successful Salesforce implementations and customers are not seeing these challenges or are not being faced with these challenges any longer? What are they doing differently than perhaps other Salesforce customers, many of the respondents to Gartner, what those customers are not doing perhaps? So, based on my engineering experience, perhaps, let's get down to the root cause. So let's take a look at those product value challenges that were identified by customers. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but let me highlight a few, if I may. And we'll have examples of how we try to avoid these challenges as we help customers implement. So business value and ROI. Well, first of all, you've got to start with a business case. If you don't have anything documented or defined, how do you know whether you're successful or not? And tied to that lack of a business case, in many cases, there's also no solution blueprint, which is the fancy word for a roadmap. And we'll show you some examples of how we try to put roadmaps together for Salesforce implementations. And then we've got lack of defined and documented business processes. So it's the wild, wild west. Oftentimes people will deploy a Salesforce solution, maybe put people through some generic training, and everyone's on their own. it comes as no surprise that there may be some limited value realization in that scenario. So low user adoption, we hear this constantly, day in and day out. Let's talk about WIIFM. What's in it for me? Let me give you an example of why implementations that don't take into account what's in it for me by users will never get the user adoption or value that they're looking for. So years ago, I got an RFP from a company in Ohio that said, we want to do leads, accounts, contacts, and opportunities. Typical RFP, we responded to the best of our ability. We made the short list. And one of the components in our deck, our presentation deck, was this concept of WIIFM. And I spent a moment or two trying to explain it. And one of the senior executives said, give me an example. I said, well, have you ever heard of a ride-along? And he looked at me with a questionable look on his face. And I said, here's what we've done in many cases, and here's what we'd recommend. Here's what we have recommended for your situation. Let's pick two sales guys, two different regions of the country. We'll go, we'll send one of our guys with each of them. They'll see what they do on a day in and day out basis. We'll see what drives them crazy. We'll see what sucks up their time. We'll see what makes them non-productive. And as a result of those findings, we can ensure that we at least propose that functionality into your solution so that we can absolutely guarantee high user adoption. Well, we ended up convincing them that we were the right firm. We went ahead with the discovery, and at the conclusion of the discovery, we one of our guys rode around with one of their salespeople in Pennsylvania, another in Iowa of all places. And lo and behold, both of our guys came back with a list of critical needs that were never part of the RFP. Specifically, salespeople, before they walked into an account, they wanted to know what open orders were, sales to date, open cases, any receivables or even credit hold information that they should be aware of. In other words, they needed to see a 360-degree view of the customer. We convinced our customer that this was some critical functionality to get end user salespeople to adopt Salesforce. We were able to scope a solution, worked with their IT folks and their mainframe people, and delivered a complete solution with high user adoption. Poor data quality, we'll talk about that in a bit, but drives people crazy, as I'm sure many of you can attest to. And unrealized business results. Well, I mentioned business case, but one of the things that people have failed to do on a religious basis is maintain their Salesforce application year in and year out. I mentioned typical 3 times a year, 3 annual increases per year. Each time is increased functionality, increased capabilities, including Lightning, for example, going back almost 3 years now, I guess. So if you're not taking advantage of some of those upgrades that you're absolutely paying for with your subscription licenses, you're not going to realize the functionality and the resultant business value that you're capable of. So looking at root causes for the functional dissatisfaction challenges that were mentioned, difficult to use, can't find what I'm looking for, too many fields, I have to scroll down the screen, and on and on and on. Activity management, this boils down to no business processes in many cases, but executives have to demand some outputs and some deliverables and some expectations from users. So more about that later as well. Activity management includes tasks and events, and we still run into people who have not integrated their Salesforce with either Outlook or Gmail. That really simplifies things. The functionality is there, it's a given. the implementation is minimal. Not enough people are taking advantage of that. Sales content management, we'll show you some examples of that. And poor pipeline management or no opportunity management process. And here's a typical question I get when I do training, and I still do 95% of our training because I am so passionate about Salesforce and I use it so many hours a day. But I'd say in a good 80% of the cases, people will stop me in class and say, well, when do you enter an opportunity? And I respond without hesitation saying, as soon as you hear about it, as soon as you get a gut feeling, as soon as someone's walking you to the elevator saying, thanks for the meeting, you might want to call Bob Smith in a few months. I think he's got a new project coming up. That's an opportunity. An opportunity is something that you have to absolutely devote some time to and create a win strategy around. So if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. So how should you start? You know, I'm sure there are a number of firms who would like to spend 6 months helping you develop a business case for a Salesforce implementation. But basically, it just boils down to what do you expect to get out of it and what's it going to cost to implement? So projected revenue increases or expense reductions. It's that simple. We've shared this template with many customers who actually do say it simplifies and kind of crystallizes the net needs of justifying a Salesforce implementation. And this is really all it takes. As long as you've got some basis for your estimates, for example, additional leads, opportunities, and wins. We thought in this example it was going to yield a potential, with the average sales of 250,000 and a 15% increase, you know, that yields a net 37,500. Now, how did we get to that point? Well, Salesforce does metrics on customers. Many of you might have been called by them, but they have a third-party firm that takes these every couple of years or so. And son of a gun, their metrics say that customers have seen average sales revenue increases of up to 37%. Well, I value my life, and I'd never suggest that that number is achievable, even though it might be. So we generally tell people to be conservative about their estimates. If nothing else, this simple exercise gets people on the same page. It gives people some idea of what to expect. And even if things change, you might recognize this as a simple Excel spreadsheet, easily modified, updated as needed. Now, let's talk about how to incrementally achieve ROI. Most Salesforce customers don't realize sufficient ROI because they simply don't define a long-term strategy. And those people oftentimes are represented by the red curve on the lower portion of the screen. They deploy Salesforce, and then their users complain that it's too hard to use and they can't find anything, and on and on and on and on. Well, Salesforce best practices, in fact, CRM best practices in general, suggest this creep, crawl, walk, run approach, where you give users enough functionality to get them acclimated to the solution, get them dependent on the solution, give senior management the results to help justify the implementation, and then success breeds success. So the success of a phase one should quickly and easily lead to a phase 2 and 3 and 4 and on. So what we've basically coined this as is a self-constrained model, where if customers don't have a long-term strategy and set the right metrics in place, they're not going to achieve the ROI or the business value that they were hoping for. It may not have been documented, but in their minds, they were hoping for it. Now, after 6 years of engineering, this represents the bulk of what I do on a day in and day out basis. Invariably, I'll sit down with a customer or a prospective customer who will say, well, Jim, here's our situation and here are our issues and here's what we want to do. And I heard Salesforce is pretty good. And they talk and talk and talk and talk, all good stuff. But generally their arms and hands are waving in the air because they just can't kind of get their arms around it. So we typically deliver roadmaps in this simple two-dimensional matrix, and it accomplishes several things. First of all, it tries to identify either the Salesforce required priorities or sequences of functionality, or it identifies the things that will give the highest return in that first initial phase. If companies don't have any clue of what their opportunities or demand is looking for, then that's why opportunities for Sales Cloud anyway is typically in that first phase. I'm showing you some typical examples here of how a multi-phase implementation strategy might work. But more importantly, on that far right-hand column, identifying the value or the anticipated or projected value realization that ought to come out of every single one of these line items. Let me give you another example. Years ago, I flew down to Atlanta. It was a customer was running Salesforce, had been running it for 5, 6, 7 years, over 400 users. But they had many of the same complaints that Gartner heard about in June of this year. And as we sat in the conference room and we heard all of the complaints and all of the frustration, I asked if they had any sort of documented roadmap, implementation vision, business processes, and the answers were no, no, and no. And I said, well, your org is highly customized. How did you get to this point? And a fellow at the end of the table said, well, when people want things, they send me emails, and my instructions are, if I think it's going to take me less than 25 hours to provide that functionality, I just do it. I said, so you release it right after you provide that functionality? Unit testing, system testing, training, nothing. He said, nope. The estimates to unravel that spaghetti mess was well north of several $1 million. This is what they needed to follow. Simple, straightforward, and it will help drive ROI. Now here's the best educational scenario I can provide. When we typically look at a customer's existing Salesforce org, we'll look at accounts, and to pick on IBM, one of the classics, we'll see accounts called IBM, International Business Machines, IBM Corporation, and there are a host of others, I period, B period, M period. Guess what? There's only one International Business Machines Corporation, but there was simply no identification or definition of how to enter an account. And our recommendation is simple: always enter the legal account name. Always, always, always. Then there's only one International Business Machines Corporation. We also see the lack of naming conventions causing poor data quality, which incidentally leads to difficulty with views, reports, dashboards, and the like. But we often see opportunities that are just so named in such a vague manner, oftentimes repeating the account name. And of course, opportunities only belong to accounts. So we never recommend that account names be included in opportunities, especially with the growth of mobile data entry. We don't want people on smartphones and tablets to be having to type in more characters than is needed. So on the right, for opportunities, here are some of our conventions for opportunities. Everything we deal with is either Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Marketing Cloud, Pardot, support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then we use a little identifier as to whether it's a new customer or an existing customer, new versus add. And then, various projects or descriptors to help anyone reading the report understand exactly what that opportunity is. And finally, attachments. First of all, people, in my experience, do not add attachments religiously to Salesforce. And again, if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. But we'll have manufacturing customers, for example, they'll get a drawing for a part that they need manufactured, and the part, the drawing number will have some crazy prefix, suffix, special symbols, and so on and so forth. So our recommendation is attach that drawing, that electronic copy of the drawing, to the opportunity, but also then rename that using a standard naming convention so that you can find it, because without naming conventions, you'll never be able to find that drawing again, guaranteed. And incidentally, I'll provide my contact information at the tail end of the webinar. If you'd like a sample of the document that describes our naming conventions, be happy to send it to you. So the root cause of some of the challenges mentioned were just lack of defined business processes. Well, if everyone's doing their own thing and it's nothing more than a version of the wild, wild west, everything suffers. User adoption, data quality, data duplicates, poor reports or dashboards, obviously related. But everything we do gets documented in a simple PowerPoint two-dimensional matrix. Why is it a simple one-page matrix? Because if the process is more complicated than that, people aren't going to follow it. So we always look for simplicity and always look to deliver ease of use in everything we do. Those processes are documented. They're used for unit testing. They're included in curriculum. They're covered in training. Everyone's on the same page. Incidentally, this slide has to do with activity management. I see a lot of people that use a field called next steps. In fact, a lot of folks at Salesforce used to use that. I don't know if they still do, but next steps is a text field that is not going to give you the same results of actually using and leveraging standard out-of-the-box activity management functionality. Again, including that Outlook or Gmail integration. Now, speaking of poor quality, in many cases, customers' orgs or their data quality just aren't ready for sales analytics. But when justified and if done properly, analytics or Einstein analytics alone can lead to a significant ROI spike. It just fuels the Salesforce engine. And executives are the biggest fans of analytics. Another example, we're dealing with an insurance company out east who we're wrapping up a 20-user pilot, soon to go to 200 users. And when talking about reports and dashboards, we collaborated with Salesforce to show analytics to give them an option for the data visualization that we thought they were looking for. Well, they liked the analytics, they didn't like the price, so they said, you know what, let's just do these 15 reports and dashboards, and we'll buy 5 Einstein Analytics licenses. Fast forward, when they saw what Einstein Analytics could give them, they immediately signed up for 15 more licenses. They said, do not do any more report and dashboard development. If people want to create reports and dashboards, cover that during training. The executives absolutely loved it. and they were able to justify it based on the value that it provided them. Now, I'm sure you've already gathered we like processes. And we've actually developed and refined a hybrid, we call it a hybrid implementation methodology, to deploy these phases with each of these 6 stages intended to deliver all of the business needs and business objectives that are part of that defined phase, back to that roadmap or blueprint. This simple process ensures that, again, everyone's on the same page. We know what's coming in this release. We know that for a variety of reasons, we're going to hold off on this additional functionality and additional business value when the next budget opens up. There are 1,000,001 reasons, but the fact of the matter is, with a disciplined, methodical approach, following Salesforce and CRM best practices, this methodology serves us and our customers extremely well. So now we're up, we're running, we're deployed. Maybe it's phase 1, maybe it's phase 2, and perhaps by this point in time, I've convinced this audience, and I've convinced other customers that this animal needs care and feeding. This is an enterprise application, and you can't do it with a part-time IT person who has 16 other things on their plate. So just to compare some options, we find that most customers don't realize that they could actually get more functionality perhaps, and more enhancements, and maybe a faster migration to Lightning if they look at their options by taking a step back or two. So it's the old build versus buy comparison. We know a lot of customers who do this all internally, God bless them. Others, for example, that we help, and others that rely on us or other providers to become their virtual Salesforce administrative support arm, if you will. So why is this worth mentioning? Because when we look to maximize Salesforce value, business value, and maximize ROI, you've got to lower costs wherever possible. So, takeaways. The challenges that were identified by Gartner as a result of their talking with actual Salesforce customers, or maybe some of the challenges that this audience is seeing in their own companies, typically are caused by some basic root causes. Identify what the root cause is, and following best practices, you can turn the ship. You can get the train back on the rails. I can come up with 1,000,001 more analogies, but it is something that can be done fairly quickly. And don't forget, naming conventions can immediately help user adoption and ease of use. So even small changes can promote and overcome some of these challenges. With adequate planning and budgeting, no Salesforce customer should expect anything less than 100% user adoption. And with that, if you've got all the what's in it for me's and what do I intend to get out of this next release, there's no stopping the progression of what Salesforce can offer for you. Finally, since customers typically don't have those skilled or experienced resources, think about other options if necessary to lower your costs, thereby increasing ROI. And with that, here's my contact information. And incidentally, Sarah did a good job of pronouncing my name. The Z is silent, so it's Safransky. Don't hesitate to give me a call or shoot me an email. If you'd like, again, our standard naming conventions, be happy to provide them to you. And with that, Sarah, I'm hoping there are a dozen or more questions.
All right, thank you so much, Jim. Yeah, we do have time to answer some questions. So just a reminder, you can type your questions into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will relay those on your behalf. We did get a few questions here. Let's see. The first question, we use pipeline dashboards, but they're never accurate. Is there a way to improve their accuracy without spending a lot of money?
Yes, and it's done with both sticks and carrots. So, we see this all the time, and here's the classic example. Each of you can go back to your own individual Salesforce applications and take a look at open opportunities and see how many, let's see, it's November 7th, see how many of them have close dates long before November 7th. Well, when salespeople don't maintain their opportunities, then the data can't be trusted. And if an executive ran an open opportunity or a pipeline report that turned out to be grossly inaccurate because it included some opportunities that the sales folks said should have been closed 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago, they're never going to be accurate. So if people are using opportunities, you've already overcome the lack of a business process challenge, but they have to maintain them. And someone needs to monitor the opportunities. When I see it for the guys reporting to me, I'll review them on a weekly basis. And if I see something that should have closed 2 weeks ago, I ding them on it, and I absolutely require that they stay on top of their opportunities.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see here. The next question, how would we estimate the expected value from implementing certain Salesforce functionality?
Yeah, I think if I interpret this correctly, I think this ties back to the business case where Salesforce calls them voice of the customer reports. And one of those last voice of the customer reports said I think the number was 4,600 customers all responded back to this third party with pages and pages of questionnaires and pages and pages of questions, I'm sorry. And their conclusion was average sales increases of 37%. So I would look online to just Google Salesforce Voice of the Customer metrics, and you will see what actual customers have told this third-party firm over the years. I haven't seen one in a while, so it may be dated, but check Voice of the Customer reports. And again, I wouldn't take the numbers at face value. I would be extremely conservative, but generally that's enough to help you at least put some numbers in a spreadsheet to get people talking.
Okay, the next question here. How do you enforce user adoption in their following defined business processes?
Yeah. Well, out of the box, Salesforce does include some login reports. So over the first critical weeks, someone needs to ensure that new users, i.e. all users, are logging into Salesforce. I was standing in the wings waiting to conduct a training session for a very large customer, one that we've been doing business with for 4 years. But this was their initial rollout. And the VP of sales for North America was the executive sponsor. And his closing line before he introduced me was, and I expect you guys to be logging in into Salesforce at least 3 times a week. And I thought, oh my God, no, they have to log in daily. So you've got to enforce logins and make sure people are logging into the system and doing what they're expected to do. Now you look at activities, you look at you look at opportunities, and that will generally be some good indicators of whether they're following business processes. And you could tell if you scan their open opportunities and you see them following your naming conventions, then kudos to them, gold star. But if they're not, you've got to change their behavior immediately. You know, going back to the previous question, Sarah, expected value. Let me give you one other example that kind of came to mind as you were reading that third question. We had a customer who had a large call center, and it was a seasonal business, and near the holidays they would typically have to bring on 15 to 20 new part-time call center agents. And for those of you familiar with Salesforce Service Cloud, it gives people the ability to do electronic commerce and address questions, issues, create cases, and so on. But it also supports CTI, computer telephony integration. And the bottom line was, with that new functionality, they were able to increase, each of their existing call center agents was able to take on a greater number of calls, finish them more quickly, and less information gathering, because as soon as the number popped on their screen, they would know who the customer was, who the caller was. And the bottom line was the seasonal FTE savings alone was enough to justify the Service Cloud and CTI implementation. Sorry for backtracking.
No worries, thank you. Okay, we did get another question in here. The next question says, we still use a lot of Excel spreadsheets, even with Salesforce. How can we eliminate those?
Microsoft Excel, the world's most popular enterprise application. I say that tongue-in-cheek, of course, because people just hate to give up their Excel spreadsheets. Well, the fact of the matter is, using Excel spreadsheets is generally requires copying data, and it's generally copied manually. And of course, when you copy data manually, thank goodness numbers are never transposed, right? So when you give that grand total to that senior executive before he walks into an important meeting, you're absolutely convinced that the numbers are all right. You know, in all seriousness, one of the things we ask people for when we do, even before we sit down and do discovery, we ask them for any of these Excel spreadsheets, and we look for, why are they using them, how often are they updating, where are they getting the data, who's asking for it, and on and on and on. So generally, it's pretty basic, pretty simple to eliminate spreadsheets altogether by incorporating that same functionality on a real-time automated basis. And one of the things I generally will ask folks with those spreadsheets on their laptops, when was the last time you backed up those critical spreadsheets? Now, I know some companies have automated time backup systems, but you know what? Salesforce is backed up on a nightly basis, replicated across multiple data centers. Really, the data in Salesforce should be a lot better sitting in Salesforce than in a spreadsheet.
All right, nice. And we did just get one more question here. How much easier is it to use Lightning UI versus our classic UI?
Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And quite honestly, it took me a while. I am so passionate about Salesforce, and I could do things with one eye closed, the other one bloodshot, with one arm tied behind my back. And then Salesforce went ahead and released this Lightning thing. Well, now that I have become a fan of Lightning, I would not say it's easier to use. I would say it's more logical and it's more consistent with the mobile user interfaces. But it's really more than that. Salesforce has ended all development for the old UI called Classic. They ended the development, so no improvements, no new functionality, no new capabilities in Classic. It's all Lightning. So Lightning migration should be on that Salesforce blueprint or roadmap as quickly as you can make it.
All right, thank you. Let's see, I don't see any more questions at this time. Any final thoughts to share, and then we can probably close up?
The old expression is he puts his pants on one leg at a time. Salesforce is so capable. It's got so much in it. And if you are planning a Salesforce implementation, I hope some of these tips and tricks will help. If you have an existing Salesforce org, put together a roadmap. Just prioritize where the fixes need to, where the focus needs to be on fixing, correcting things, and by all means, what is it going to take to get 100% user adoption?
All right, thank you so much, Jim, and thank you everyone for attending today and for submitting your questions. Just a reminder, this webinar was recorded and you will receive follow-up via email with a link to view that recording. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.